What I'm intending to do is really to take a pedagogical focus, so quite different to Paul's session. The practical stuff was very interesting. What I want to do is talk about how you can use audience response technology, seems to be the Australian term ART, though I know there's lots of different terms. To talk about how we can use it for feedback. Feedback's the big thing, and that's going to be a big theme in this presentation. I'm going to talk about a slightly different use for it, though, because we've used it for feedback with students for 3 or 4 years. And I know based on some of the other papers today, feedback and students, there's a really strong link, and it's working really very effectively. What we think is more new is looking at it with tutors, and I'll explain why I think that's relevant in a moment. And then I'm going to reflect on some of the limitations of that practice as well. So my background is I am English, not Australian. You may be unsurprised to hear. And I was based in the UK at Newcastle University and Northumbria University, and then latterly at Sunderland University Business School. And it just struck me, there's a real similarity between where I was 4 years ago and where I am now. So Sunderland University, Riverside campus, it's actually a nice campus, this campus. Has about 17,000 students, average temperature 9 degrees in Sunderland. We had about 300 people on the undergraduate business degree. In the lectures, there were 150 to 200. QUT, slightly different, also Riverside, much warmer, significantly warmer. I was Skyping my children this morning, and they were standing there with, you know, just kind of vest and shorts on, and it was 7 o'clock at night there, so it's warm. There's 40,000 students in the business faculty, and it's just this ginormous institution. When I was interviewed for my job at Sunderland, QUT, I was at Sunderland, and it was 3 in the morning, and I was talking to them, and they said, "How are you with large classes?" And I said, "It's one of my favorite things. I love large classes. It's a chance to engage, and very confident. I've been doing lots of large classes," and I had no concept that they meant 12 to 1,500 students. That was a large class. I was talking about 150. So it's a different scale. I have 500 in a lecture at a time, and my team is 25 tutors in any single unit. So most semesters I manage 50 tutors. So it's just a different scale to the one I was used to thinking about. So here's a question to start us off. One of these is Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, and one of them is Sunderland. And I just thought I'd ask if you can identify which is which. 91% of you are correct. The first picture is, in fact, Sunderland. I'm trying to just illustrate as I'm going through some of the ways in which I use keypads with lecturers and tutors, and I'll try and explore why as I'm going through the presentation as well. But I thought I'd start with going straight to the pedagogy and use a quote from Sally Brown, who says, "Assessment drives learning." And this seems to be an increasingly accepted way of looking at what happens in universities, that if we assess it, students are interested in learning it. And if we don't assess it, students are less interested in learning it. And as much as that may break your heart, and you would love students to be here purely for the joy of developing critical ways of looking at your subject, this relationship seems to be very well proven. And my view, pragmatically, is we can use this. Because if assessment drives learning, we have a problem, because lots and lots and lots of research is telling us there is an issue with assessment. Phil Race tells us assessment is broken. We hear that feedback is something that doesn't work under the current dominant models of feedback. So what students tell us when we ask them, what do you think of the feedback you're getting on your learning at university, and much of this research is UK-based, is they say, it's unhelpful, I don't read it, it's so vague, I don't know how to use it. And what Phil Race says is it's too late. If anybody's heard Phil Race speak, he actually argues that if you don't give students feedback within 48 hours of them completing whatever the assessment is, you are wasting your time. And he's got evidence to support that view, which is terrifying when you have, as I do, 1,300 assignments, which we have to think about how to give feedback on. So students' perception of feedback is deeply problematic in Australia and in the UK and in lots and lots of other countries, according to some of the research. So here's a question. This is a UK one to start us off. According to the UK Higher Education Funding Council, what percentage of undergraduate students never collect their feedback on assessments? Never. We have a mix of views, and the answer is 42% of you are correct. Oh, sorry, I think there we go. The answer is 46%. 46%, almost half, never actually collect their feedback, which is no surprise then when they're asked by the Funding Council at the end of year survey, what did you think of the feedback on your assessment? They say not very much, because half of them haven't even read that feedback. In my unit, I thought this was interesting, I'll do a survey to see. So the way it works at my university is students hand in their assignments to an assignment minder desk in the library, and they then, after we marked it, put them back there and they collect them from the library. So it's very easy to see who's not picking up, because you can go and say 3 months later, how many assignments do you have for this unit? What do you think the answer was? Remarkably close. 45% of my students, and I give good feedback, weren't even bothering to collect the assignment. And my 25 tutors who were working with me, and we'd be putting all this energy into how to frame it in a positive way, which will be constructive for the next assessment and so forth, they weren't even reading it. And that really shocked me and started us thinking as a team about how we can do this more effectively so that we're not wasting our time and so that students are learning. So what were the issues? The issues for me in terms of assessment were we have large teaching teams. They have very mixed experience within the teams. You might have people who are members of faculty. They've been working at the university for 25 years. They have their PhD. They have research interests. You might have a student who's doing a master's degree who's doing a tutorial for you, or a whole range of managers in business who are coming in just to do tutorials. So there's a very widespread range. Writing feedback, written feedback, as everybody knows, takes a long time to write, and it would appear isn't being read in any case. Students often focus on the mark and not the feedback, so that we found that students would look at the result they're getting, and they really wouldn't pay any attention to what was being written behind that result. They just cared about the result at that point. Students weren't reading or didn't understand the kind of comments, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means later. And often, as Phil Race argues, feedback comes too late. By the time 4 or 5 weeks have passed, there's been a process of moderation. They finally collect their assessment. It's really too late for them to use the feedback. So we came up with some answers, and we've been, playing around with different practices over the last couple of years, so that we now do a range of things to try and engage students in feedback. So one of the things we do immediately is we use clickers in the lecture theatres, and we give them instant feedback. So we ask questions which ask them to apply the theoretical knowledge that they might have been asked to read or that we've talked about in the way that you've seen other people talk about today. And that can be really positive. It can be incredibly powerful. Not only because you get, the students get a sense of whether they've understood, but also the lecturer gets a sense of whether there's an issue, and you can be flexible in your approach to lecturing. So if you can see that there's a major gap, then you have a chance to address that gap. We also do marking exercises, which I'm going to demonstrate with you within our lectures, and get the students to mark assessments as if they were the tutor, and then they use their clicker to indicate the mark they would give to it, and that gives us a chance to engage with them in discussions about assessment criteria and how usually they're a whole grade above where the academic would be in marking the assessment. And we do this before they submit assignments so that there's a formative learning experience. We also use team-based learning activities and peer instruction activities in the lecture to try and get people to engage in a deeper sense with some of these practices and concepts. We use scratch cards as well as clickers, and we actually alternate because Scratch cards basically looks like a scratch card. You can buy blanks, but you know the code behind them. You pass them out, you get the students into groups of 6, and you basically use a peer instruction or team-based learning practice to get the students to negotiate with their peers what the answer is and scratch off what they think the answer is. And if they don't get the star straight away, which indicates they didn't get it right, they have to renegotiate. And it's, again, a good way of making the lecture theatre come alive. I alternate them with keypad because I actually find that by alternating, it can keep students engaged, whereas if you do the same practice each week, I find that students can disconnect from it. So we alternate, but it's essentially the same principle. We then do written feedback as well on short assessments, which we post online. And at the end of the semester, of course, we do summative written feedback as well. These are different ways in which you can provide feedback. And I'm going to try and illustrate this really by arguing that it's feedback here is based on the idea that you're giving them feedback to help them learn. It's not just a summative thing to test what they have learned. Okay, a quick question based on something I read in the Times Higher recently. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is I use these kinds of questions mid-lecture, sometimes to signify a transition in some of the concepts that we're trying to talk about, but sometimes to try and stimulate a discussion. So, sadly, not the University of Surrey. Correct answer is California Institute of Technology. What's interesting about this type of question is, as I think as was demonstrated really clearly in Dr. Mazur's lecture this morning, you don't retain this information unless you happen to be from these institutions and you have a personal vested interest in retaining it. But what you can do as a way of helping people to retain it is use this type of knowledge-based recall question as a springboard for some deeper discussions. So I would use this style of question to then get my students to talk about what does it mean to come top in that? What's the criteria that are used to generate that position? And so forth. Okay, I want to demonstrate one of the activities I use. We have something called a business brief. The students first-year students have to submit this very short assignment where they are researching a business problem and advising the managing director of a company on how they would, whether this problem, this concern needs to be addressed. I hand an example of it out in the lecture theatre. 500 students read it individually in silence for 10 minutes. And then we ask them to mark it using the assessment criteria, again, individually in silence. Then what we do is get them to form groups. And this is really drawing on some of the principles of peer instruction, because what they have to do in the group is negotiate the mark that they think is fitting. So when they talk to their peers, you will find a spread of marks within any group, and they have to convince each other which is the correct mark to give before indicating to me with the clicker the mark the group has to, or individually, in fact, the mark that they think is appropriate. It works beautifully in lectures because not only is it a way of getting participation and engagement and getting them to think about the assessment criteria in a deep way, and for many of them, it's the first time they've even looked at the assessment criteria for the unit. But what it's also getting them to do is to practice team exercises, which is one of the things I'm trying to develop in a business faculty. So by getting them to use teamwork within the lecture, you can then start talking about issues like peer influences and team development, as well as questions of social loafing. Was there somebody who you were asked to speak to who actually didn't contribute to the discussion, even though it turned out later they might have had the correct answer? And why may that be? Is it because of their cultural background? Is it because of their personality? Are there more complex explanations for it? So we're getting them to actually see that just as in the workplace these negotiations take place, we can use the technology to facilitate them within the lecture environment. This works so beautifully that the institution, my institution, decided to invest very heavily in turning technology and purchased 1,300, I think was the initial purchase, keypads after just one semester of them being used. And I then started thinking about, we should do this with tutors too, because we do marking exercises, but we hadn't used the technology with tutors. We just expect them to mark. So I started to think about whether this learning could be transferred across to a different setting. Lots of benefits. There's lots of research on using technology, the audience response technology with students, and essentially they talk about all the things we've heard a lot about today. So they talk about the lack of loss of face. You don't have to put your hand up, particularly for cultural reasons, and many students won't do that. There is no loss of face. In a 500-seater lecture theatre, you have to be a pretty confident person to put your hand up and make a comment. But using the technology, everybody gets to engage, and the lecturer gets to respond to the whole class's perception of a particular practice. The evidence is that it can deepen learning, it can deepen conceptual understanding, and it promotes engagement in a way that lots of other traditional lecture formats really just don't do. So why not use it with teaching teams? Previously, the way moderation worked at my university was basically like this. The team met twice a semester, 4 assignments were taken, the team would mark those assignments, and then there would be the same 4, and then we would have a discussion, and the discussion would go something like this. Okay, look at the assignment by Johnson. What did you give Johnson for the first marking criteria? And somebody, usually the most experienced tutor, would say, I'd give it a 6. That was the kind of standard. And then I would, as the coordinator, would have to say, would everybody agree with that? I mean, you can just see how badly these things go, because what will happen is the majority of people, and all theory will tell us this, are unlikely to move from the initial framing point. So for somebody to say, really, I gave it a 0, that wasn't likely to happen. If you were a newer tutor, you certainly weren't likely to challenge the dominant position that was being voiced. And more importantly, at the end of the meeting, when people went out of the room, I really didn't know whether people had understood how to mark using the criteria or not. I only had my assumptions that people had reached agreement. So, these were the issues. There were some dominant tutors. I also found that the discussions at those meetings tended to focus on marks. There's a lot of, is it a 6, is it a 5, but not actually about how to construct feedback in a way that students were going to learn from. And then post-marking, as a unit coordinator, I would do a lot of moderation, post-marking moderation, which would indicate that there were clearly problems, by which stage it was very little for me to do anything about it, too late for me to do much about it, other than to address the marks themselves rather than the practice of marking. So we started to think about how can we improve the consistency and quality of marking. And we decided to draw on this very basic model of engaging with the teaching team in order to make feed-forward, concurrent, and feedback, all of this coming together to make our practices more robust. So feed-forward, I had extensive tutor orientations where we would look at assessment, we would look at the criteria, we would have conversations about where the priority might be at any given moment, lots of discussion about assessment and feedback, not just about the assessment brief, but about clarifying other aspects of it. We would do pre-marking moderation using clickers in the teaching room to assess variance using that sample of assignments. I would have pre-marking workshops where we'd talk about feedback, and I'll show you how I would do that in a moment. Concurrent, we use a system called Review. I don't know how common that is in the UK. Do people know about Review? Review is it's basically a place, it was developed as a way of engaging students with graduate attributes more clearly, and it's now used widely as a place where academics mark, so you would put your feedback into this online system that students log in and look at, rather than go and collect a paper copy from the library. I'm happy to talk to anybody about it later. We would also use peer review of feedback. Because this software system where tutors mark is open to all tutors, people could look at each other's feedback and get ideas about what styles of feedback might be effective. Post-marking, I still do post-marking moderation. I think it's fundamental, particularly in really large units like this. But what we do most importantly is a debrief for tutors. So after marking, we have a meeting where all the tutors come together, where you're talking about some of the lessons. So some of the lessons might be things like, this assessment criteria clearly was problematic because not only did the tutors struggle to agree on it, but therefore the students must have struggled to hit it effectively. So that may mean we may need to review the assessment for next academic year. It might also talk about student performance against a criterion. If it was problematic, how as a team could we engage with that criterion better in the following semester? So feedback at the end, the three things together had a major impact on the feedback in the unit. So I thought I'd give an example of the way I conduct this, both with tutors and with students. So what you have here is a very short extract from a student assignment. Basically, this is the summary and recommendations part of a business brief. And what I'd like you to do is just read it very quickly, and then I'm going to ask you how well you think that student has performed. So this is what the student's written, and the question I asked the tutors, all the students in fact, is if this is the marking criteria, just one of the marking criterion, what grade would you give it? And I've put the Australian grading system here because I've now learned it. It took me a long time. So in my moderation meetings with the teaching team, I'd ask people to do this part in silence. So I'd ask them to indicate their grade, having looked at the assessment, without talking to their peers about it. And what you see there is a spread of grades, which is what I sometimes see in my teacher moderation sessions. I just thought you'd be interested. That is a fail as far as I'm concerned, not least because the second recommendation was just nonsense. But what I would then use this for, and this is really where you have to move beyond the technology, which I think was a really key theme today. You have to think about pedagogically the purposes of what you're doing. You have to then use this to springboard a detailed discussion about what that may mean. And what that would mean is that if I let that group of tutors go and mark student work, it really wouldn't be equitable, because the way they would mark that work would be deeply problematic depending on which student you were and which tutor you got. So what we then do is have a deep discussion about why there is a spread of marks within the room. And it involves tutors speaking, so it's not a completely anonymous process. But what happens is, I would say, for example, I see the majority of you put this as a grade 4, a bare pass. Can I hear some of the arguments for why that may be the case? And then I would say, I see some people gave it a higher grade, why may that be the case? And we use it to springboard really a social construction of how to make sense of the assessment criteria. This, I thought, was working so beautifully that we thought we should investigate it slightly more rigorously. So a colleague from a different school in the business school, Larry Neal, joined together with me, and we decided to do some research into this last academic year. So we took 3 units, around 20 people working in each of those units. We decided to use different approaches to moderation. One, the traditional method, which I described, basically not using turning technology. One using turning technology, and one using a combination of both. We observed, recorded, and analysed the moderation meetings. We also surveyed the teacher teams both before the moderation and after the moderation practices, and we analysed the turning point reports from those sessions. I can't talk about all of the results yet. Larry and I have published one paper from it, and we're hoping to do some more this year. But essentially, what we found was that when you have audience response technology, when you use the clickers within the moderation meeting, far more people participate. And actually that echoes some of the findings that other people have talked about today. Not just participate because they're clicking a button which gives you their grade, because everybody was doing that, but then subsequently, when the discussion started, more people spoke than in a session where there wasn't any technology like this used. And our analysis from that, our conclusion from that, is that the graph itself, which shows a spread of grades, gives people a space where they can speak in a way in which when one person puts their hand up and says, I'd give it a first, that just doesn't happen. So it's creating a window for discussion which just isn't there using the traditional method. Tutors reported very clearly that they felt far more confident marking work and providing feedback on work after these activities using the technology. So the tutors who had a traditional moderation method and were then asked, did they feel more confident? Everybody reported an improvement in confidence having had a moderation meeting, but the ones who were using the technology had a significantly stronger confidence than the others. And feedback, and I'll explain why the feedback comes in by giving you an example. Here are some examples of the feedback I got from the teaching teams. People are bolder, they're less likely to be influenced, and made independent contributions. I feel more confident and prepared, particularly the new tutors were saying this, though it was interesting that some of my more experienced tutors who'd been teaching in the unit for a long, long time, once they were using the keypad for the results to be, and the results appeared, it was often my most experienced tutors who were way out. And that came as a coordinator as quite a shock, that people who'd been there for a long time really were not reading the criteria in the same way as some of the newer tutors. And the problem really was with the more experienced staff as much as it was with some of the newer tutors. So it was a really rich learning experience for everybody. I then started to think about using feedback. So I want to give you an example of some feedback. I've adapted this from something Phil Race did, but the feedback's genuine. So read the feedback, which came on your written assignment. The mark was 30%. And what Phil Race used this to was to prompt questions about what's the purpose of feedback, what signal are we sending the student, what do we expect them to do having read that feedback. And he says that was genuine feedback. And I think this is the signal that's being sent to the student very clearly. I can only imagine how I'd have responded if I'd have got that kind of feedback anyway, at any point in my career. So I thought, this is interesting. Let's try this with real feedback that my tutors have given to my students over the last couple of years. So using this online system where with the feedback's put online, I could extract very easily feedback. And I thought, let's see if there's a correlation between the feedback and the signal it's sending to students. So this is real feedback. And I want you to imagine you're the student and you're reading that feedback. So I'm asking the tutors, what signal are you sending? And the easiest way to ask is to say, you've read it, what mark do you think that got? And most people are saying fail or possibly pass, bare pass. The answer here is fail. The actual result for that student was a fail. A very clear fail, actually. From memory, it was something like 20% that this assessment was given. Why have they started with good effort, do you think?
They're trying to be supportive.
Because we're increasingly told the model of feedback should be start with something positive and then go into development. But this isn't positive, this is misguided, because it's sending really the wrong signal to the students. And I was really stunned that there were lots of these kinds of comments. I once had a student say to me, I read my feedback and it started with something like good effort, and I'd knocked that assignment out in 2 hours after I came in from the pub the night before it was due to be submitted. And I just thought, this lecturer is an idiot because they'd said good effort. And it really made me realize we We don't know how much effort they put in. It's ridiculous to comment on effort. That's not something we can assess. So you can be positive without saying something like this. Let me give you another example. Okay, the majority of you are saying top grade, grade 7. The answer is grade 6. This student got actually a relatively low grade 6, just on the border of getting grade 6. Why did they get why would you anticipate a grade 7? Yeah, it's telling you you're brilliant. Where is it telling you what you've done wrong? And in fact, if I was that student, and this is definitely the environment that I'm in at QUT in Australia, I can't speak so much for the UK anymore, but the environment I'm in is if I was the student reading that, I would go straight to appeal. Because I would be saying, as my students say to me, what have I done wrong? It doesn't tell me I've done anything wrong. And we also identified that this is something that tutors commonly do, actually even if they had achieved a grade 7, that what we're doing in our feedback is we're so used to trying to be deeply supportive of the students who are barely scraping a pass with, extensive feedback about how they can improve, that we forget that the people who are operating much higher, they still need feedback. This student needs to learn how to move to grade 7. And even if you are a grade 7, you need to learn really why your work isn't 100%, assuming it isn't 100%. So we really saw as a teaching team that the signals being sent is quite misguided. So the point is, what do we want students to do with feedback? Do we want them to chuck it in the bin, or is there really a deeper purpose for that? And I would hope, with all the effort that goes into creating feedback, that we want to make sure that feedback is something that is used. So this is just some examples of the way that the teaching team and I came up with different ideas about how to construct slightly more constructive, useful feedback. So we do still start with the positive, but we think carefully about what is positive and what is just flawed. So we don't say effort or good attempt. We also make sure the feedback focuses on the assessment criteria that students have been given for the course, which makes sense. We signpost for support. So if the institution has lots of learning support centres where they can go for help, we have stop phrases, a bank that tutors can cut and paste these phrases in. I think you may benefit from speaking to a language and learning advisor, that kind of phrase. And we can paste them in to save tutors time in constructing feedback. We also found, and we did some feedback from students on this, that just personalising it, putting the student's name at the beginning and the tutor's name at the end of the feedback, actually had a really positive impact because students read it as being addressed to them. And they knew who was speaking to them, rather than this kind of random couple of lines of feedback that they thought had just come from anywhere and didn't really speak to their assessment. So they're just some ideas. This bit worked really powerfully, and for anybody who's struggling with student perception of feedback in your institution, this worked so beautifully that the teaching team and I decided that what we did with feedback was actually really positive. We'd put lots of effort into it, and we felt we did it quite well. And therefore, we were going to, right from the start of the semester, say to the students, feedback is something we do really well in this unit. We're deliberately giving you excellent feedback because we know how formative that's going to be as you move on in your degree. This is a first-year subject. And then every time we gave feedback, we told them we were giving them feedback. So every time in a lecture, we gave a question and they applied a concept. We then, before the graph came up, said, we're now going to give you feedback on your learning. And then we put the graph up and we explained how they've learned from it, or how they may still need to learn, potentially, from it. So feedback was something that we talked about, especially the idea of instant feedback, that feedback wasn't something you wait till the end of the semester and you get a paragraph on your final exam. But feedback is something that we're constantly engaging within the unit. And it had an incredibly positive impact on student perception, and indeed on student learning. So, my take-home messages. Audience response technology, turning technologies, these are things that I think there's a very growing body of work which tells us they're very positive for students. But I think there are some interesting ways in which they can be used in teaching environments as well, especially with large teaching teams. Combining them with pre-marking moderation meetings, and the key here is pre-marking moderation meetings, means that you have an opportunity to draw on the strengths of the technology to make sure that your teaching teams have a really deeper understanding of the criteria before they start applying them to students, and to help you, if you're the coordinator, to find out when there are concerns within the team before it's too late. Tutors, particularly inexperienced tutors, really realise very positive benefits from this. I thought I should finish as well by saying that when keypads, when I first heard about keypads, I read a paper about them, and my background within my discipline is critical management, so I have naturally a very critical stance to, well, everything. And when I first heard about this, I dismissed it entirely. I thought it was complete edutainment. I thought it was removing all intellectual rigor from what we were trying to do at universities, and I was deeply cynical. And I actually decided to adopt them. The university had 80. I decided to adopt them for one semester because I had in my head a paper which was going to talk about the dumbing down of higher education. And after one semester of using them, I really had to rethink my practice and my thought pattern, because I realized that actually they can be used, I think they can be used as a way of dumbing down education, but I think they also have a really deep learning impact when they're used effectively.